Even the most normal royal is nothing like the rest of us, so the weirdest royals must practically be a different species. Don't believe us? See if these royal weirdos don't change your mind.
If she lived today, Princess Isabella of Parma would be just another liberated woman, but things were a little bit different in the 1700s. The limited marriage market for royals often led to disasters, but Crown Prince Joseph of Austria struck gold when he fell head over heels for his young wife. Alas, Isabella was less interested in him, and it may have been because she was a lesbian. According to the book A Treasury of Royal Scandals, she became obsessed with her husband's sister, Christina. She sent her letters that said things like, "I am told that the day begins with God. I, however, begin the day by thinking of the object of my love, for I think of her incessantly." Isabella was also unusually well educated for the time, and she was openly hostile to the idea that she existed just to have kids. Nevertheless, she was pregnant quite often. This reportedly made her depressed and obsessed with the belief that she was going to die, which she did, of smallpox at the age of 21. There will almost certainly never be another British royal like Prince George, Duke of Kent. Before World War II, there was still plenty of reverence for the Windsors, and the newspapers covered up George's indiscretions, which there were plenty of. He was known for being the smartest and most attractive of his family members, as well as running with a fast crowd and enjoying fast cars. He also had a penchant for drug use. His older brother, the future King Edward VIII, reportedly had to wean George off morphine and cocaine after he became seriously addicted. George married his second cousin, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, and by all accounts, they genuinely loved each other. But that didn't stop him from sleeping with plenty of other people, male and female. And since he lived during a time of unreliable birth control, it's believed that he fathered numerous illegitimate children. George's longest extramarital affair may have been with the composer Noel Coward. They weren't exactly discreet about their 19-year affair, as the British security services reportedly knew all about them walking the streets of London dressed like women. George's hedonistic life ended in 1942 at the age of 39 when he died in a mysterious plane crash.
Conspiracy theorists have suggested that he was in fact assassinated. But why?
Maybe Gian Gastone de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany's life would have been different if his marriages weren't so terrible. The union was arranged by his father, and it was doomed from the start. His bride, Anna Maria, was a widow with no desire to marry again, and the 26-year-old Gian was undeniably gay. Within 2 years, they were living almost entirely apart from each other, and Gian didn't exactly spend his time constructively. He ran off to places like Prague, where his lover would find poor students to frolic with the Duke in exchange for cash. He also got drunk and fought in seedy taverns and lost much of his money playing cards. Eventually, Gian had to come back to Florence and take over for his father. But instead of ruling over his people, he spent most of his days in bed, where he would entertain various young men and women. He would occasionally leave his room for official dinners, where he would get so drunk that he vomited in front of the esteemed guests. This went on for almost a decade until he died in 1737 at the age of 66. There are plenty of reasons to feel bad for Marie Louise, granddaughter of France's King Louis XIV. To start, her mother basically ignored her from the moment she was born. She was married off at 14 and got pregnant 5 times over the course of 10 years, with all of those babies dying. Marie also reportedly had a disturbingly close relationship with her father, Prince Philippe II of Orléans. It started when she was 6 and had a life-threatening illness. After she recovered, she and Philippe were inseparable. He visited her for hours every day during her first pregnancy, and rumors spread that they had an incestuous relationship. It probably didn't help matters when he painted her in the nude. Furthermore, the princess was reportedly a raging alcoholic. Her other vice was gambling, and she lost obscene amounts of money in single games. She would also throw scandalous dinners and invite her priest so that he could see everything she was doing so that she wouldn't have to go to the trouble of confessing to him.
It seemed to be a good idea at the time.
If you lived in northern Italy during the 14th and 15th century, you were probably bending the knee to the Visconti family. They consolidated their power through tight friendships with popes and various royal marriages. In 1412, Filippo Maria Visconti took over from his brother Giovanni, who had been assassinated. That might sound like a scary start, but Filippo actually did pretty well for himself at first. He reorganized government finances, introduced the silk industry, and waged successful wars against his neighbors. He eventually died of natural causes in 1447. But according to the book A History of the Italian Republics, Filippo was so cartoonishly ugly that he couldn't bear to have people look at him. He hid in his palace and never showed himself to his soldiers. And when an emperor came by for an important peace talk, he refused to meet with him, as he instead spent much of his time as a recluse. Germans don't exactly have a reputation for being spontaneously passionate in the bedroom, but there are often exceptions to any stereotype. And if police files uncovered in the Prussian secret state archives are to be believed, the German royal family got up to some freaky stuff in the late 1800s. Princess Charlotte was the older sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II, so she was very well connected. In 1891, she invited a group of aristocrats, the Kaiser's brother-in-law, and a member of the government to a secluded hunting lodge. They drank, danced, and participated in a series of orgies. Afterwards, someone sent the attendees blackmail letters that included descriptions of their behavior along with helpful illustrations. Historians believe that the scandal-loving Charlotte sent the threats and that she might have invited the people in the first place just to entrap them. The controversy resulted in one person being arrested and another being killed in a duel. Meanwhile, Charlotte got off scot-free. As of 2024, Princess Sri Rasmi of Thailand is still alive, but she's never going to become queen, as her ex-husband, Maha Vajiralongkorn, divorced her before he ascended to the throne. But that fate couldn't have been too much of a surprise to her, considering that she was his third wife.
Her family is under a cloud of scandal and corruption allegations.
Before they broke up, they lived an interesting life together. This was perhaps best illustrated by their relationship with their poodle, Fufu, whom they seemed to be weirdly obsessed with. Opponents of the then prince released a video of a bizarre party that they threw in 2001. Sri Rasmi was completely naked except for a G-string, while plenty of courtiers watched. She even got down on the floor and ate cake next to the dog. The video caused a sensation, but not in Thailand itself, where there are strict laws prohibiting saying anything bad about the monarchy. Sri Rasmi didn't get custody of Fufu in the divorce, though the dog's weird journey was far from over. He was made an Air Chief Marshal, and after he died, his funeral lasted 4 days. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was the niece of the King of Poland, and she was also reportedly one of the most notorious sadists of all time. When she was young, her uncle taught her about Satanism, while an aunt instructed her in the pleasurable side of pain. By the time she was 15 and married off to a Hungarian nobleman, her dark personality was already well established. She asked her new husband to build her a torture chamber to her exacting specifications, and he delivered. The Countess then proceeded to torture her servant girls. She stabbed pins under their fingernails, or she'd tie them down, covered them with honey, and left them to be attacked by insects. Eventually, she moved on to abducting peasants and then even the daughters of nobles. Elizabeth believed that human blood would keep her young and healthy, and she would do things like bite off chunks of the poor girl's flesh. Her connections protected her for a long time, but eventually she was tried for 80 counts of murder. She was ultimately convicted and locked in a windowless room where she died 3 years later. Spanish Crown Prince Don Carlos never ascended to the throne, though his life did inspire the story of a famous opera. He had it tough from the very beginning, as he was born with serious physical deformities. Among other things, he was hunchbacked, and one of his legs was much shorter than the other. As he grew up, he developed slower than he should have, both mentally and physically. This might have something to do with the fact that his family was so inbred that he only had 4 great-grandparents instead of the usual 8. Don Carlos's mental problems led to serious behavioral issues. When he was just a child, he developed a propensity for hurting animals and girls. He once maimed more than 20 horses and was also known for roasting rabbits.
What's the matter?
Oh, there's a rabbit in there!
Don Carlos also enjoyed whipping women, some of whom were paid off afterwards. He would reportedly attack anyone, with his victims including servants, court officials, and a cardinal. He even once made a cobbler eat a pair of boots that he decided weren't good enough. Don Carlos's behavior only got worse after he suffered a head injury, as his tantrums became infamous at court. So it was hardly a shock that he never found anyone who would marry him and that he died before he could produce an heir. Princess Alexandria Amalia's Bavarian family was well known for their mental struggles. Her father was famously eccentric and liked to write poetry about the most bizarrely trivial things. Meanwhile, her nephew Ludwig II was obsessed with building castles to the point that he basically bankrupted the country. As for Alexandria, when she was young, she was reportedly obsessed with cleanliness. She would only wear white so that she could see any dirt that got on her. Then, one day, when she was 23, she was walking around her family's palace on tiptoes and moving sideways through doorways while avoiding touching anything. She then told her family that she'd just discovered that as a child she'd managed to swallow a full-size grand piano made of glass. She also believed that it was still inside her, so she needed to be careful that it didn't break. Weirdly enough, Alexandria wasn't the only noble in history who thought they were made of glass. It was such a popular delusion that it appeared in medical books and plays. Contemporary psychologists think it might have been a way for powerful people to express how they felt fragile in their important roles. Research about 18th century Korean Crown Prince Sado has posited that he suffered from bipolar disorder. His symptoms included depression, anxiety, suicidal and aggressive behavior, and feelings of delusion that began when he was just 13. He also exhibited signs of obsessive-compulsive disorder. According to Korea, a historical and cultural dictionary, when Prince Sado went off on an unauthorized pleasure trip, his enemies at court told the king what his son had been up to. The allegations included tales of assaulting palace women, seducing nuns, and killing eunuchs, among other horrible crimes. When Sado returned, his father ordered him to kill himself by drinking poison. The prince refused, but the king wasn't finished, as he also ordered that his son be confined without food or water in a rice chest, where he died 8 days later, most likely of dehydration or possibly of starvation. According to The Guardian, you could call Elizabeth II's grandmother, Queen Mary, a kleptomaniac. She would go to people's homes and straight up steal stuff. Royal Babylon says her technique went something like this. She'd pop by her house and see something she'd like. Instead of making conversation like a normal person who'd come to visit, she'd just stare at whatever object she wanted for a long time. This was the first warning sign. If you didn't get the point, she'd sigh and loudly say something like, "I'm caressing it with my eyes."
Precious.
If she was the queen, you'd probably give in and offer whatever it was to her as a present. But what if it was a family heirloom or something else you couldn't bear to part with? Then she'd just have to take it without you noticing. When people realized what she was doing, they took to hiding anything they thought she might take a shine to before she came over. She countered by showing up unannounced. The antique dealers of England had it bad as well. Queen Mary was known to stop by, take whatever she wanted, then forget to pay for it. Eventually, her stealing got so bad her assistants were on high alert, and if they found out later she'd managed to sneak something into her purse, it was returned with a note that there had been a misunderstanding. Empress Elizabeth ruled Russia on her own right and was the aunt-in-law of Catherine the Great. Someone with absolute power can do anything she wants, and what Elizabeth wanted was for her court to cross-dress. The issue was that Elizabeth thought she had fabulous legs, but the style of the day, big hoop skirts for women, meant she couldn't show them off. Men's clothes, on the other hand, had breeches and tights that exhibited their form. Since she was in charge and didn't want to be the only one who looked different, Elizabeth would throw huge balls where everyone had to cross-dress, or else. According to St. Petersburg and the Russian court, 1703 to 1761, the young Catherine actually enjoyed these parties, but she and the Empress may have been the only ones. Men's clothing wasn't flattering on all women, but it was the men who really had it bad. To go from the form-fitting clothing they usually wore to giant hoop skirts meant they had no idea how to maneuver their huge bulk while walking, let alone dancing. They were also expected to wear women's hairstyles, which meant enormous wigs. With a change so drastic, accidents were bound to happen, like when Catherine was knocked over while dancing and fell under a man's hoop skirt. Perhaps not surprisingly, the cross-dressing balls ended when Elizabeth died. Queen Nzinga of present-day Angola had a lot on her mind. She was busy fighting the Portuguese for most of her rule, managing to hold them off for 40 years. During this time, she also had needs, so she pulled together a harem of hot guys. In an odd twist, she made them dress like women, but maybe it made sense since she was strutting around looking like a man. But Nzinga didn't have time to go to her harem and decide who to sleep with each night. So according to Harvard's library collection, she devised a workaround. Every night, 2 dudes would fight to the death, and the queen would bed the winner. Then the next day, she'd execute him. At 75 years old, she decided she wasn't cut out for this anymore and disbanded her harem. But that doesn't mean she ditched everyone. From Eve to Dawn, A History of Women in the World says that she married one of her youngest wives, which makes her a serious cougar and a queen to be reckoned with. Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom was completely obsessed with death, and lots of important people in her life died when she was in charge, including her mom, her daughter, and most famously her husband, Prince Albert.
Will you marry me?
After he died, she declared the longest period of mourning in memory, and this is back when a random uncle dying meant you had to wear black for at least a year. Victoria never fully recovered from her grief and wore widow's weeds for 40 years until her death in 1901. And that's not all. Victoria also regularly took cocaine and opium, according to Beardy History, but those were legally available at the time. You can't compare today's illegal drug use to what used to be basically prescription medication. But Queen Victoria did dabble in some more controversial stuff, namely chloroform. Contrary to popular perception, the Queen liked sex a lot. This meant she was pretty much constantly pregnant while her husband was alive.
And also, when she does get pregnant, she's really scared.
During the birth of her 7th child, she was given chloroform and loved it so much she requested it at the births of her next 2 children. Chloroform was such a controversial drug at the time that when word leaked that the Queen indulged, the population was shocked. The famous medical journal The Lancet insisted the rumors couldn't be true, but they absolutely were. Catherine the Great was one of the most famous women ever to rule a country. She governed Russia with an iron fist and did a pretty good job of it. Today, she's well known for her crazy libido, but the most famous story about her is an urban legend. She wasn't killed doing it with a horse, but she did like doing it with guys. Lots of them. She wasn't as prolific as some kings, though. When she fancied someone, she stuck with him for a while before moving on to the next conquest.
We women are too much creatures of the heart, aren't we, Catherine?
Yes, Your Majesty.
However, when you're busy running one of the largest countries in the world, you don't have time to waste on men who don't measure up. Catherine didn't take any chances. According to the Poet and the Vampire, the Empress had a friend named Countess Bruce try out anyone she was thinking of having a relationship with. This made a twisted kind of sense. Catherine was so busy, she needed to know that any guy she was going to take to her bed was worth it. So Countess Bruce stepped in to be her official sex tester. The Empress of Art says that she took her role very seriously, sometimes too seriously. At least once, she was found consorting with a tryout well after he was passed on to Catherine. Marie Antoinette is probably one of the most famous queens in history. She was married to Louis XVI and lived an opulent lifestyle, at least until the point where they lost their heads. She had everything handed to her, literally. There were dozens of people following her around handing her things whenever she asked. This apparently got unbearable and she wanted a way to escape. Unfortunately, the way she chose gave the impression that she was ridiculing normal French people. First, she had a personal mini palace built on the grounds of Versailles, but it wasn't enough. She wanted a place where she could really get away, a place that made her feel like a poor person. So she built herself a fake village.
It's not too much, is it?
Modern Nation says this included 11 different cottages, as well as a lake, a watermill, a working dairy, a windmill that didn't mill anything, a barn, and various other peasant-type buildings. Marie Antoinette wasn't just half-assing this. She expected her guests to totally buy into the fantasy of being a poor farmer or whatever. Women were ordered to ditch their fancy gowns for something simple and common. She even brought her kids to learn about farming. Ultimately, her imaginary bonding with the peasant class wasn't enough to save her head, but she thought she tried. When you're Empress of the Romans, you can do pretty much whatever you want, and Valeria Messalina sure did. Her exploits were legendary, literally, as in we don't know for sure if they're true. But according to history's naughty bits, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Elder, and many more all tell the same stories about her. For example, the Empress is said to have owned a house of ill repute where ladies plied their favors for cash and she made a tidy sum out of it. Roman emperors say she even made upper-class ladies participate in the nightly goings-on.
To the health of Messalina! To the health of Messalina!
Valeria Messalina was a champ in the bedroom, according to reports. Supposedly, she frequently won contests about who could bed the most men in a night, sometimes racking up 25 conquests, which is pretty crazy if true. On the other hand, it might just be a story she passed around to keep her husband, the Emperor Claudius, in line. These days, most royal families are more style than substance. There's little chance they could order your head chopped off. Still, Queen Elizabeth II could throw her weight around when she wanted.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister of Canada, for making me feel so old.
The Evening Standard said she had a servant wear her new shoes for a while to break them in for her. Then there were the sandwiches. According to the Daily Beast, when Queen Elizabeth or members of her family ate sandwiches, they'd better not have crusts or corners on them. This bizarre tradition supposedly started over 150 years ago when Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, decided it was bad luck to eat anything that looked even vaguely like a coffin. That meant your square sandwiches had to go. Albert has been dead a long time, but for some reason his sandwich phobia lives on. Joanna, who may not have been as mad as her name suggests, had the misfortune of marrying a hot king. Philip, also known as Philip the Handsome, knew how to control his wife, and he was a jerk about it. According to Mad Monarchs, if he got into an argument with his volatile wife, he'd leave her alone in their bedroom for days. She'd wander around her room banging on the walls, and since she was supposedly argumentative in the general, this happened a lot. It didn't help that Philip was a massive womanizer, even for a king. Once he was dead, however, he belonged only to Joanna, and she seized the moment hard. Time says that once she had her husband's dead body all to herself, she wasn't about to give it up easily. She delayed the burial, and when he was finally interred, she had his coffin opened so she could kiss his feet and make sure his body hadn't been stolen. And even though he was dead, she ordered that women be kept away from him, although it's unclear whether anyone but Joanna was interested in a formerly hot corpse. Like Joanna the Mad of Castile, Maria Eleonora of Sweden may have had serious mental health issues. At the time, she just came across like she was completely bananas. The queen knew it was her job to give birth to a son, but after several miscarriages and stillbirths, when she finally gave birth to a healthy baby, it was a slightly weird-looking baby girl. According to Mad Monarchs, her reaction was, "Instead of a son, I'm given a daughter, dark and ugly, with a great nose and black eyes. Take her from me. I will not have such a monster."
That's not nice.
And oddly, bad things kept happening to the baby. A wooden beam mysteriously fell on the cradle. Another time, she accidentally fell down the stairs. Then there was the time that a nurse dropped her straight onto a stone floor, injuring her shoulder, which remained slightly crooked for the rest of her life. Not even the king could give the poor girl a break. He raised her as a boy, but after her husband died, Maria spent the rest of her life worrying about becoming destitute, while her daughter, Queen Christina, ruled Sweden, crooked shoulder or not.